Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh. Last time we covered the first half of chapter 5, and we talked about how this was the golden age of literature in the Hebrew world, that the men of Hezekiah, which was right here at the time of Isaiah, were starting to record a lot of different types of wisdom literature that would go on to become a lot of the writing section of the Hebrew Bible. And so this is at a time when language is at its high point. Then we talked about the imagery of the vineyard that Isaiah used, and we talked about how that vineyard was destroyed by a drunken party of revelers who were abusing it. And we ended it very nicely with the jaws of hell coming up and swallowing them down. And so we're going to pick this up with the second half of this chapter, which starts with what we call a woe oracle. A woe oracle is an oracle pronouncing doom upon people. It begins with the Hebrew word hoi, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But we're going to talk about this woe oracle that's here. And then we have a series of small chiasmus that exist in this chapter, and we'll show you the structure of those. And there's a larger chiastic structure that we'll also point out. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the punishment of the wicked that Isaiah prophesies here, and the final ensign of destruction that is going to be lifted up. And so we begin this with this great verse in verse 18 here that says, "Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes." I felt it was very appropriate to throw in an image of Jacob Marley here, because that's what this sounds like to me. The idea that sins and wickedness are tied to us and that we are having to drag them along is precisely what Isaiah is talking about here. Now, you'll notice that there's a small chiasm here in the way this is worded, that we start with iniquity, and then we talk about cords, then we talk about ropes, and then we talk about sin. You'll also notice that I have crossed out the word cart here and changed it to as with the ropes of the bull. This is because the Septuagint translates this word as bull. And the word for cart and the word for bull is only a one-letter difference in Hebrew. So it seems that there may have been a scribal error here. And which one fits better, cart ropes or the ropes that you would put around a bull, a heavy animal? We are talking about strong ropes that you would need to handle either one of those situations. So the idea is they're being bound very tightly here. So I don't think it changes the meaning much with either word possibility there. But I think I favor the idea that the word here should be bull rather than cart. We also have the idea of, just before that, cords of falsehood. Now, this word falsehood is the Hebrew word shav. And that's not really a rare word, but it has a very weird meaning to it. Sometimes we have, the translated as cords of falsehood. The word doesn't quite just mean falsehood. It means, really, if anything, I would say means covenant breaking. And from the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, we have this quote from S. Mowinkle, who says, "We therefore conclude that shav very often stands as a straightforward term for magic and a magic spell, and that in this sense it comes to include those who perpetuate injustice as well as sinners, those who break the covenant, and the false ones, also any trivialities or lapses of the chief magicians which give them a false reputation. Generally, the aspects of falseness and covenant breaking are universally accepted, but Hallott also adds, to what extent, if at all, the idea of magic rather a magic spell has to be considered as the origin of this aspect of the word is a matter of judgment." So there's some divided opinions there as to whether this means cords of magic, cords of covenant breaking, cords that are unreliable or false, cords that might break on you. The last one doesn't seem like it works well, because we're talking about that they're bound tightly with these cords. So I don't think it's saying that cords that are unreliable. That doesn't seem to fit the context well. But the idea that the cords could be cords of covenant breaking, that does seem like it would fit pretty well here. And that may be the meaning of this word. But it is a difficult passage to translate exactly what types of cords or ropes we're talking about in this setting. Now, as we move on, we have here, "who say, let him be quick. Let him speed his work that we may see it. Let draw near and let it come, the counsel of the Holy One of Israel, that we may know it." You'll see there's a very structured pattern here. As we're continuing to talk about these who are wicked, who have been bound in this way, it's further defining them as people who say, that it needs to happen faster. It's not very clear what it is that's happening faster. It seems to me that we're talking about the fulfillment of prophecy, that they're not satisfied that the prophecies are being fulfilled quickly enough. And so they're sort of saying, you say there's this destruction coming, make it happen fast, because we don't believe it's really coming. We don't believe that you can predict this type of woe to us. And so that seems to be what's happening here. And they're saying, let it happen quickly so that we can know it. And as we move forward, we further define them with another statement of woe. It's the Hebrew word hoi, which is translated as woe. And we have a series of 4 tight chiasms here. And when we talk about chiasms, we often talk about intentionality. Did they really intend to structure the language this way, or was it coincidental that it happened like this? When you see 4 in a row like this, it does seem pretty strongly a case that this is an intentional structure they're using here. And it says, woe to those who say for evil good and for good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, who are wise in their own eyes and in their own sight shrewd. So we have these 4 tight chiasms here, and it's all about a reversal of things, that they are saying that that which is evil is actually good. They're saying that that which is dark is actually light. They're saying that the bitter things are actually sweet. They're saying that they have wisdom, but it's really only them that believes they have wisdom. We have this idea of reversal here, that they are putting themselves forward as good and worthy members of society, the leaders of society. But in actuality, they are the ones that are bringing bitterness and darkness to that society. We go on further then in verse 22, woe to those who are warriors at drinking wine and men of valor in mixing strong drink. We have here again this word for strong drink, which is shakar, which generally means beer, that we talked about a little bit last time. It might be some sort of a grape drink like brandy in this one, but it's a strong alcoholic drink along with wine. And we've talked about them reveling and partying over the product of the vineyard. And so that's what we're seeing here, that they are warriors for drinking wine. They're men of valor in drinking strong drink. These are the braggarts at the bar. They have no real heroism, but instead they are the ones who will tell you all about how great they are when you just get a good beer in them or two. That's who we're talking about. And then we have this, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right. This is a little bit of a loose translation here. It's very difficult to render in English exactly what this is saying and have it sound like good English. A more literal translation would be, who make righteous the guilty because of a bribe, and the righteousness of the righteous they take from him. That would be a more literal translation of what's being said here. But you need to understand a little bit more about the way this word works. The word righteous can mean as you normally think of righteous meaning, but it can also mean to have a victory in a court setting. And remember that we are setting this up as though it were a court setting. And so we have here, who make righteous, in other words, give a victory in a court setting to the guilty because they have been bribed. So the idea here is what it says here, to acquit the guilty for a bribe is the meaning of this. The acquittal or the righteousness of the righteous they take from him, which deprive the innocent of his right is kind of a loose rendering of that. But that's what it says actually there. So the idea here is that the court systems have become corrupt. They are not only warriors for drinking, but that they are taking bribes and they are rendering incorrect judgments in court. Now, we also have a larger chiastic structure that is present in the chapter here. It starts with defining social injustice back in verse 8, which you can refer to in the previous video from. And then we had the carousing, the drunken reveling in verses 11 through the beginning of verse 12. Then we talked about their spiritual insensitivity in the second half of verse 12. And then we, again, with the beginning of this, talked about their spiritual insensitivity in verses 18 through 21. Then we went back to the carousing on 22, and then again, the social injustice that we just covered on 23. There is this larger chiastic pattern throughout the chapter. Now, I am always a little skeptical for larger chiastic patterns because sometimes they are just too loose and too easy to see what you would like to see. But this one really has some good backing to it. And I didn't come up with this myself. This is from the notes in Net Bible. So several other scholars have looked at this and seen that they also agree that there is this chiastic pattern here. And so it's pretty solid. It does seem like this is an intentional structuring where he brings in the social injustice, then the carousing, and then their spiritual insensitivity at the center being the point of focus, and then stepping back out through those same accusations again. And so this woe oracle throughout the chapter seems to make one big long indictment of the people. And so as we've indicted them, we move on to chapter 24, and we start talking about the consequences of this. Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as the dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will be rottenness, and their blossom go up like the dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. We're talking here about punishment, and punishment in fire, something that will happen to have a lot of theological implications in later years, and also in post-biblical times. The idea that the wicked are punished in fire is something that we start to see in Isaiah. And so we have here that they're going to be burned up in fire as though they were stubble or dry grass. Now, I will point out that this verse 24 has what looks like a chiasm in it, and I actually incorrectly thought there was one there until I went back to the Hebrew and realized that the chiasm only exists in the English here, that the Hebrew is a different word order. So that there's not actually a chiasm there. We have here the idea that they're going to be burned up, and we have, again, an agricultural metaphor. Isaiah loves using metaphors with agriculture and animals. It's just what he does a lot of. And so the idea here of burning down a field with its stubble is part of what you do when you are getting to replant the field. And we talk about here that they will have, their roots will be rotten, and the blossom, the thing that bears fruit, will just go up like the dust. The reason is because they've rejected the law, or the Torah, of the Lord of hosts. Lord of hosts is his military title, the Lord of armies. And they despise the word of the Holy One of Israel. Nice tight little couplet there at the end. Then we have this section here, which seems to be related to that, but there's also a possibility that this might be misplaced. Some people feel that this section should be in chapter 10, right after verse 4, and it would fit nicely there. They think that a copyist may have accidentally put it here, and the big reason for this is because there is a refrain that shows up here in a few verses that is throughout chapters 9 and 10. And it does seem like that makes this part of that poetry. However, it doesn't totally fit out of place here, but it seems like it would fit more in place over there in chapter 10 after verse 4. When you're copying things by hand, sometimes those types of errors do happen. We're not sure. But where it's at right now, we have this section here, and when we get to chapter 10, verse 4, we'll look at it again and see which place we think it fits better at. So it says, therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. And the mountains quaked, and their corpses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. So we have this lovely thing right here that the Lord was angry, so he reached out his hand and smacked them. That's pretty much what it says. And when he did this, the very mountains quaked. And then this interesting statement that the corpses were as refuse. Now, this word refuse only shows up here. We don't know what it means exactly. Their corpses were as something. From context, refuse seems like it's a good thing. What else would be in the midst of the streets that you'd be comparing a corpse to? So we're guessing a little bit that the word refuse is the right meaning for this word, but that word is only used here, and we're not really sure of its meaning. Because of their disobedience, they get struck by the Lord, by his hand, which is stretched out, and not only does it shake the mountains, but it seems that the dead get thrown up and put out into the street. Very interesting thing that seems a little out of place with what we've been discussing so far, but that's what it says. Then we have the refrain here in verse 25. For all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. This is a refrain that we will see throughout chapters 9 and 10. Multiple times it's going to show up there. And so this makes us think that maybe this is not the right context for this section. Now, I will also point out that the Dead Sea Scrolls has a slight variation here. It has a plural for the word hand. So, and his hands are stretched out still. Doesn't make a lot of difference, but just pointing out that there is some variation there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then on to 26, he will raise an ensign for nations far away and whistle for them from the ends of the earth. So Isaiah, as well as Jeremiah and a few others, speak of this idea of an ensign being raised. And most of the time, this is about gathering Israel, that you raise this ensign. An ensign is a flag or a banner, that you raise this ensign, and you're doing it, and sometimes even whistling, so that the nations will bring back the children of Israel. But Isaiah loves to invert symbolism. Sometimes Isaiah will speak of raising an ensign for the purpose of gathering back the scattered of Israel, the scattered of Zion, but that's not this case. This case, he is raising a flag for an ensign of destruction. So the idea of an ensign being raised is going to come up at least 6 more times in Isaiah. And in most of those places, it does refer to the gathering of Israel. But this one is about signaling a destroying army to come in and lay waste to Jerusalem. Remember that symbols don't always have to mean the same thing. And one of the things that Isaiah enjoys doing is giving symbols that we have certain expectations around and subverting those expectations. And he loves the symmetry that we get from an ensign being raised up to have destruction and scattering take place, and an ensign being raised up to have them being gathered back in. It provides a nice bit of symmetry there that is very typical of Isaiah. God is represented here as though he were a kind of general, giving the order for the invading armies to attack. The identity of these armies is left unstated, heightening the ominous effect, although Isaiah and his audience would surely have had the imperial forces of Assyria in his mind. That was the major threat of his day, and this description he's about to give makes it sound like we were talking about Assyria. I also want to mention here the word whistle. King James Version has the word hiss, but more research into the language, pretty much everybody agrees now that this is appropriately whistle. And so, yes, he's saying that he's going to whistle for them, or give them a signal, a calling signal of whistling so that they come. Hiss was always a little bit strange, but hiss is almost certainly the wrong translation here. But as we look at the description of what's going to happen when this ensign is raised, it is quite ominous. And it's put together in a series of couplets. And behold, quickly, speedily they come. None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps. Not a waistband is loose, not a sandal strap broken. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves seem like flint, and their wheels like the whirlwind. Their roaring is like a lion, like young lions they roar. They growl and seize their prey. They carry it off, and none can rescue. They growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold, darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. Notice that we ended on a 3-line bit there. We'll talk about that in a moment, but let's talk first about what we're talking about, what this first part says. He's emphasizing the speed at which they move, and that they aren't going to be tired. They're not going to be stumbling. These are a very disciplined group. They won't stop for rest. The idea of a waistband is not a waistband is loose and not a saddle strap is broken. This is what you would do as a soldier at night when you wish to take your sleep, is you would undress and you'd take off your shoes and you would have your rest. They're not going to be stopping to rest. This is going to be people that move very quickly in a very disciplined way with sharp arrows and bows bent. These are people that are coming to kill. We also have the idea that they are coming with horses, and the wheels of their chariots are going to be so many it will be like a tornado, like a whirlwind, a storm. And their horses' hooves will beat the ground with this loud pounding noise. This will cause a roaring, and they refer to it like the roaring of a lion. The lion was a real animal that existed in Israel at this time, and they would have interactions with lions, and they were terrifying beasts. And so the idea of roaring like a lion, that is the most scary thing you can run into when you're out traveling in the wilderness, is a lion. And they're going to growl and seize the prey. Just like a lion, there's just nothing you can do. The lion roars, and then the next thing you know, you're being eaten. They're going to carry it off, and nobody can get it back. You just can't take prey from the lion. It's a lion. And I love here, I adjusted the translation so you can see that the same word is used here when they says they will growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea. We usually don't refer to the sea as growling in English, but I wanted to do that here so that you can see it's the same word as what they were saying the lions were doing. So they're comparing the lion's roar to the crash of waves at the sea. So we would normally say roaring of the sea, but I wanted to point out it's the same word that's being translated as growl. There's another word that is translated as roaring earlier. Isaiah uses lots of synonyms, so we have to get a little creative. I will point out that we have this phrase on that day. This is a phrase used in Hebrew to indicate that we are talking about the future. And this whole section is kind of translated in present tense. It might be better translated into future tense. Tense is a really touchy thing in Hebrew. It's the thing you're going to find most translations disagree with, because Hebrew doesn't quite have tense the way English does. And it's sometimes very difficult to tell what tense things should be in. This should almost certainly be a future tense throughout. Translations are what they are. I didn't try and redo the tense on this. This last 3 lines here, the poetic imagery is proto-apocalyptic. Apocalyptic literature really wasn't much of a thing in the time of Isaiah, but it starts to take its form here. And when we say apocalyptic, we're talking about end of the world. And most of the Hebrew Bible doesn't really talk about the end of the world. The world is just something that's always been there and will go on forever. Yes, there's creation that happened long ago beyond anyone's memory, but through most of the Hebrew Bible, it's just sort of understood that life will just continue on. But then starting around the time of Isaiah, they started talking about this idea of an end of the world kind of thing. And this imagery starts to get there. We have here the idea that it's darkness on the earth, there's darkness in the heavens, and it's a reversal of that first moment of creation where God says, let there be light, and drives back the primordial darkness that's over the face of the abyss. The last bit here, light is darkened by its cloud. It's actually her clouds in the Hebrew. There's no word it in Hebrew. It's just going to be either male or female. But because it's female, the only antecedent that could be possible for it there is the word land. Doesn't make a total lot of sense. This word for clouds, which is Araphim, it only shows up here. And so this is another word where we're not quite sure what should be meant there. We're fairly certain that it means clouds here, but the root that it comes from means to like drip down. So we're thinking that this is like storm clouds, rain clouds. This last bit of line here might be damaged. We would expect it to continue with the couplets, although occasionally we do end things with a 3-line pattern. But the Hebrew itself looks a little mangled. But the idea here is one of sheer terror. We have this invading army that's incredibly disciplined. They're armed. They're going to be destroying, and you'll have about as much chance against them as a lamb would against a lion. It's just simply going to growl, bite you up, carry you off, and there will be no one who can rescue. And that is the dire situation that we closed chapter 5 with. If you like this, found it useful, like and subscribe. We have a Discord server where we talk about all things Hebrew and Hebrew Bible. Come join us over there, and I'll see you in the next one.